original.
From Story Studio Network.
Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
Well, here we are. It is the 31st day of October. Yes. Halloween's all set, and in these parts, it looks like the kids may get a bit rained on, but, so what? Nothing to worry about there. They'll all be out having a ball and looking their scariest best and having fun while at it. So if you're out there tonight, or if you're listening to this after the Halloween, hope it was all good fun for you. All right, here we go. On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast, and a busy week. And it's kind of funny how we all get excited about the fall economic statement because we know pretty well what's in it. But there are some highlights that we really do need to drill down on. So in the house today, we've got Keith Leslie. Of course, he's a veteran Queen's Park commentator. You see and hear him a lot on CHCH television in Hamilton these days. And John Wright is with us. He is the veteran pollster whom we rely on to take the pulse of, what's going on in the room and across the country, and certainly here in Ontario. Former Premier of Ontario, Kathleen Wynne, is with us, as is the former PC leader here in Ontario, Tim Hudak. And I'd just be curious to hear what you guys think in terms of sort of the excitement, the enthusiasm, the hype, the overplay of what is the fall economic statement. John, it's not like we didn't know what was coming, and the finance minister pretty much delivered. He gave us what he said he was going to give us.
Yeah, and I don't recall a time when people in the province have wildly cheered or followed an economic statement. I don't think that that's going to begin anytime soon. It'll be interesting to see when that check arrives in people's bank accounts, or however it's going to arrive by check, what the reaction is then. But I think that, the critical part of this from a political point of view is that if the province is going to go to the polls in the spring, then they've got a head start now by putting money in people's pockets and juxtaposing themselves against the other two parties.
Well, indeed. And I think one of the first things that came out of the finance minister's mouth yesterday when asked by, the press gallery in the media studio was about that check. And, I won't say they're doubling down on it, but they're literally committed to it no matter what the criticisms may be, or there's a better use for that money, or it should be means tested. He made the case yesterday, certainly in front of the media and for the rest of the legislature.
The cost of food, the groceries are up 20% over the last 3 years. And while inflation and interest rates are coming down, the cost of groceries, the cost of gas, the cost of housing is still impacting a lot of households and families right across Ontario. So I could wait maybe a couple of years to be able to provide some relief. I think the relief has to happen now, and that's why I'm giving back $200 for every taxpayer in Ontario, plus $200 for every child under 18. That's some 15 million people that will get a $200 check, some $3 billion at a time that they need it most. And so I think this is going to go a long way helping those families struggling with the cost of living.
But you're still adding over $6 billion to the deficit. And since the Ford government took power in 2018, the provincial debt is up 36% to $429 billion. So is it really a good idea to not pay down that debt when you can? Because that's quite a burden. As you guys say, it's the highest subnational debt in the world.
We're helping people at a time when they need help the most. And by the way, our economy in that same period you just calculated has grown by over $300 billion. So in fact, our debt as a proportion of our economy has actually gone down. In fact, we've seen the lowest debt to our economy in over a decade. And our borrowing costs have come down. In fact, our borrowing costs are coming down about $1.2 billion this year relative to our 2024 budget forecast. In fact, $4 billion lower than we had predicted just in the 2024 budget. So this is real money that, while people are struggling, when the costs of many things are high, affordability crisis in Ontario and beyond, you hear from many. I've talked to a lot of people right across Ontario, and many are struggling to pay the bills. So this is a time when we can step in and help them, at a time where we also are in a good, strong fiscal position. We got a credit rating upgrade to AA from DBRS. We've had the lowest interest expense in some time. We see, if Ontario were a country, we'd be one of the top 20 countries in the world. And we're one of the few, if not the only one, that has a path to balance, that is getting credit rating upgrades and managing people's money responsibly. And by the way, we're able to do this because our taxpayer revenue has gone up and our deficits and our borrowing has gone down. So if not now, I don't know when.
So it's an interesting rhetorical twist there at the end, Kathleen Wynne. If not now, then when? I mean, it assumes that it has to be done. I mean, that's what the assumption is right off the bat.
Right. And you say he makes the case. I don't buy it for a number of reasons. The first one being that just because you can borrowing to give people a one-off $200 check it's just not, it doesn't make any sense. It particularly doesn't make sense, Dave, when, as you said, there is no means test. So to say that the billionaires in this province, the millionaires in this province need $200 in January, it's ludicrous. It just doesn't make any sense at all. And if things are so rosy, and if they are rosy into the future, then institute a tax cut. If that's really what they're seeing in the forecast, then fine, institute a tax cut. But $200 to everybody. There are so many people in the province who don't need it, and there's so many who do. And I don't begrudge the people who do need that money, but to give it to everybody makes absolutely no sense. So I think that this as a kind of flagship policy in the fall economic statement it's pure politicking. It's a pre-election ploy. I mean, there are other things in the fall economic statement that I really like. I don't know if you want to go into them now, but I really like the increase in IVF. The fact that more families will have access to IVF in that program in 2015, and I think it's a really good thing that it's being expanded at a time that they can. So, but the $3 billion hit to the Treasury, unmeans tested, it makes no sense.
We asked this question a little while ago, maybe a couple of episodes ago, Tim, and that was, where are the fiscal conservatives in the Conservative Party in Ontario? And that kind of gets at it, but I think I'm hearing the same sort of thing. It's not that we don't think that people would make good use of the money. This is not even a Band-Aid situation. This is really short-term, flash in the pan, the $200. Yeah, family of four would get $1,000, and in February that might be kind of handy. But a longer-term play, to me, politically, I think even plays out better, doesn't it? Never mind the economics of it.
Well, for our Halloween podcast here, Dave, I decided to come as the, somewhat frightening and increasingly rare fiscal conservative in the province of Ontario. That's the costume I've got on here today. Yeah, I mean, we talked about this last week. I would love to see more effort to pay down debt. We borrowed significantly during COVID for good reasons, to keep our heads above water. But paying more of that debt down, I'd prefer to see if you have a one-time windfall, as the minister talked about, from higher HST revenue due to inflation. And secondly, I'd target tax cuts, probably income tax cuts and business tax cuts, to encourage long-term investment and job creation. All of that having been said, that this is a measure that is achieving really two things. It's a very popular initiative. A family of four, $800. You're talking real money here, right? Secondly, everybody's debating it. It has become a focus point with everybody else on the other side, whether they would tweak it or not do it at all. So it's working, I believe, politically. I'd be happy to come back too. I agree with Premier Wynne on the IVF funding. Happy to see that, and I can talk about that a little bit. I will note too, there's something that to get underplayed. We're falling very far behind on housing targets, and that's going to require a lot of attention in the time ahead.
After all of that, we're not going to be in a situation where the housing targets aren't going to be where they need to be in the next 3 years.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be quick on this, and I want to hear the colleagues on the economic statement, but Look, interest rates went up, and that caused the math to turn upside down. So a lot of projects didn't proceed. But here's what I'm very worried about. Well, there are a number of initiatives that were put in previous housing bills to speed up the approval process, to reduce development charges, to hold municipalities' feet to the fire, and also have some carrots as well. I worry the government's eased off the pedal a little bit on this and given a little too much leeway to municipalities to ignore the tools that are on the shelf. Now, as interest rates are coming down, I hope in 2025, we'll see the government really redouble its efforts. And if municipalities don't build the homes we need, to force them to do so.
Keith?
I don't think there's any chance in hell they're going to meet their housing targets or that it's even remotely possible. I mean, it's just they're falling so far behind, and these updated figures just from the spring budget are showing how much further behind they're falling. So it might be a few years yet before we get the interest rates and the buyers and everything in the right position where they can actually start really building tens of thousands of homes. They need, I think, 150,000 a year. They're nowhere near that. So politically, for such a key keystone part of their whole platform, it had very little mention at all in the fall economic statement. Back to the original about the $200 checks, and as Tim points out, it's a thing we're talking about, and it's because it is a flashy thing. It does seem fiscally or economically reckless, not to means tested. I mean, to be sending the likes of Drake and Kevin O'Leary checks for $200, it's just ludicrous. When you could, as you say, the assumption is that these checks have to be given out. Well, then give $400 to people who really need it, for whom it would make a huge difference, as opposed to $200 to everyone who is not going to make a great deal of difference for a great many people. So that's just, literally just proving that this is a pre-election mini budget, and that they're teeing this up. The checks are going to come in January and February in time for the likely spring budget in March. As many people pointed out in the fall economic statement, next year the projected deficit is $1.5 billion. Gee, what's the economic reserve that they set aside? $1.5 billion. So it sure looks like we're going to get a balanced budget in addition to those checks coming out. So I think that we're seeing them definitely positioning themselves for a spring election. But as to the point, it's good thing to see Tim show up here as a fiscal conservative, because the Ford government, I mean, adding over $100 billion to the debt, despite the pandemic. I mean, they just keep spending. They had $6.9 billion in extra revenue just since March, and they spent $5 billion of it right away. I mean, they're just not fiscally responsible. They should be paying down a lot more. But as I say, I think they're clearly set up for a balanced budget next spring, and that will be their campaign platform.
Yeah, but even if we balance the budget, John, I mean, just the cost of the debt. I heard yesterday it's like the third or fourth highest cost in the budget, and we're really not getting much for that money.
Well, you're right. It is a huge amount. And even though you can say that it's one of the best credit ratings and it's got, compared to other countries in the world, we would be at the top. It still is an enormous amount eating away at what could be used. And secondly, it's the same in every government across the country, particularly the federal government. I think when you look at the giveaway in this, notwithstanding the potential for it to be means tested and take away an argument that it's just going out to everybody, there are priorities, however, in this province. I mean, it may have been prudent to take $1 billion of that and put it into long-term care. It might have been prudent to take $500 million and, pledge it to emergency wards or for attracting new doctors to the province to fit into the Jane Philpott framework. I mean, what's coming out of this economic statement it's good news, but it's only about handing out cash as opposed to paying down something or prioritizing where it should go. I think, in a way, that hands the opposition going into this particular election, even though the premier and the party is well ahead in the polls, it does give them a reflective point for when they go to the people and say, look, these guys are willing to give money out to billionaires, just as you pointed out, as opposed to paying for more access to doctors into emergency wards, but even things like long-term care homes, which we desperately need in this province and certainly are not being funded in any other way.
Well, one of the things that kind of hit the headline then, Kathleen, is that, we're talking about we're going to extend this, tax cut on the gas prices and so on. And 5.7 cents a liter sounds like a lot, and it is. I was in a cab last night and coming home in the evening, and the price of the pump was about $1.37, $1.38, something like that. In the morning, it had been $1.44. And so it tweaked. I'm thinking, okay, that can't have been that quick turnaround in terms of we cut the taxes just based on the fall economic statement. But I mentioned it to the cab driver. And you know what? He just talked about the price of oil in the Middle East and what was going on over there and the geopolitical bullshit that goes on and how that affects the price of gas. It was not top of mind that, oh, look at that. Doug Ford just gave me back 6 cents a liter.
But I think what he's doing is he's just extending a cut that's been in place, Dave. So
Sure.
nobody's going to feel it. And to your point, there are all sorts of other factors that come into it. Every time, and this government has done this a bunch of times on fees and on taxes like the gas tax, that's a hit to the treasury, right? And so even though the gas tax cut is kind of illusory because it goes up and down because of these geopolitical factors, it's a selling point. It's like the $200. The $200 for so many people in the province. I love what Keith said, that, double it for families who really need it and leave the rest, use the rest of that, or cut it in half and only give it to people who need it, and use that money for things that are really, really in desperate need. I mean, John's identified some of them. We're going to talk about homelessness later in the podcast. There are so many issues that need to be addressed, and cutting the gas tax or extending this gas tax cut does not help the Treasury deal with infrastructure building, because that's what that money is for.
Well, let's get to the homelessness, and we already talked about missing the housing targets, Tim, and kind of dovetailed with that. We heard numbers from the food banks across the country this week and how high they are. And I mean, literally, if you talk to Neil Hetherington at Daily Bread, he will tell you that we are still not at the peak in terms of use of the food banks just because of the pandemic. So we're still on this real increased severe trajectory in terms of the demands on food bank. All of this is tied back into housing, the homelessness, the encampments, and boy, again, great that I've got the $200 in my pocket, that's cheaper at the pumps, whatever it might be. But there's a real cost to that poverty that was not addressed yesterday.
Let me connect the two a little bit too. And the last comment I want to make about, you had the clip of Minister Bethlenfalvy there. He is somebody who enjoys watching the players on the ice, and Kathleen and I know them, and John and Keith covered. He's been a really steady, strong performer. Comes across as highly competent, but pretty relaxed. And, in 4 years in that portfolio, he's playing error-free ball. I can't remember a single thing that he had to backtrack on or explain or walk back. So hats off to him. And the thing that came across well in his argument of why he's doing the $200, why he's doing it when he will in January, around the cost of living crisis. And the challenge is the opposition will say, well, we could spend it better, but they've not really nailed down what they would spend it on. And I bet you, Dave, if you polled your audience, a lot of them would nod with what the finance minister said on his motive behind that $200. I'll be quick and happy to come back. So I know my colleagues have a lot of observations on the homelessness issue. I've never seen, it's breathtaking in scope, right? It's not a big city issue. It's a small city issue, larger town issue of encampments. Number one, I don't think that somebody has a right to encamp in a public park. I think they are dens that cause behavior that are more harmful to those that are in it, and destabilize people who are already on the edge. I think law enforcement should have the ability to clear those camps. I do not think it is right for a judge to wade in and say when they can or when they cannot. That should be up to the politicians to do so. Do we need to create more housing? Absolutely. There are tremendous obstacles, whether that's NIMBY forces number one, stopping new affordable housing. Development charges are very high. The approval process is too long. But I don't know if it's equal, right? If you build the housing, does that mean the encampments are gone away? I think you need to have an approach that builds more homes, more opportunities, will actually allow law enforcement. And I think, Dave, we're heading to a point now where we need to move on mandatory treatment. There are some people so far gone, this notion of voluntary treatment, I think, is now passé.
Well, we're getting that from the mayors in some cases, right, Keith? I mean, what is it else we can do? And it's easy to say, the city should move in and do these things. But quite frankly, the problem, it was like the refugees here in Toronto who are living on the streets, and it was a federal problem, not the city's problem. But the city had to go and find them housing. The city bore the burden of this. So this whole idea of mandatory treatment, or, you know, involuntary treatment, whatever you want to call it, is a real issue, as hard as it might sound, but that's where the municipalities are sitting right now.
Well, of course they are. They're at that position. And the big city mayors put together their coalition, and they asked the province, please give us one minister that can be responsible for homelessness, because it stretches across so many ministries. It involves, you know, 3/4 of the government. They want one point person. The government didn't do that. They also want the government to give them the power to, you know, as Jim said, to have the politicians make the decision about where the encampments are, not anyone else. So Premier Ford has come back, interestingly here. He said to the municipalities, give me a show of united force that you want me to use the notwithstanding clause so that we can go in and evict these people out of these encampments and force some into mandatory treatment. So it's become a real political football here, and that's not helping. That's not adding to the, you know, some increased funding and some more resources as what's needed right now to help the police and the social workers and the municipalities to doing front line with these encampments. And what we've got is the premier saying, well, give me a show of force so I can use the notwithstanding clause. If you want to use it, if you're threatening to use it, get together, get a plan together to deal with the homelessness issue, put some funding, some serious resources behind it, and perhaps legislation using the notwithstanding clause to force those that actually need treatment. We're talking about reinstitutionalizing some people. And I think given the state of homeless encampments now, I think that's a debate that needs to be had. Then a lot of people are going to say that despite the horror shows that we saw with institutions in the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and even the 80s, that we need some back.
You know, John, I just bristle though every time I hear notwithstanding. I can't imagine that that's the answer here. There has to be a more comprehensive, thoughtful answer. I mean, to Tim's point, it's not just about building housing. It's not just about affordable housing. It's the kind of housing. It's the services that go with it. It's all of those things that we don't want to, you know, sort of lace together. To use the notwithstanding clause, that I don't imagine that that's going to go a long way to solving the problem in the long term.
No, it's not at all. In fact, all it's going to do is produce a whack-a-mole, right? Like, you just evict people from one place, where do they go? And you're right. The people who are in these encampments are, in some ways, you can range them from destitute to mentally impaired to simply homeless. And they literally have nowhere to go. And this is an issue which is affecting every city, every major city across the country, whether you're in Halifax or Vancouver. I mean, you have large populations now which are occupying public space, which may annoy some people. But what I also find I would think disappointing in all of this is that we do have issues which straddle all kinds of different levels of society. And I go back to things like long-term care and demographics, which are moving in a very direct way to an older society where we have healthcare burdens that are going to be incredible by the year 2036. I keep saying this, and you can see it. We have issues where people are in need of assistance because they're living in places like that. I mean, you can't even take a place outside of the city and have an encampment of it, because then it's just going to turn into a refugee zone. But there's no apparent bridging to have a discussion about this. Wow. I mean, does it take an institute to be created in order to come up with a think tank approach to this? No, I mean, you could do that. But if this is common to all of these municipalities, I mean, I would think that showing the leadership to come to the table with some kind of prepared solution with this, to give some guidance for everybody, that's what's needed, not some eviction notice for everybody, because once you send them out of that park, they got to go somewhere else. And even if you write them a ticket for $400 for blocking some intersection in downtown Toronto, it's not going to get paid because they don't have the funds to deal with it. But I find it remarkable. We do have some challenging issues demographically and from a societal point of view, and there seems to be no place in order to bring the people together to come up with an adequate approach, especially when you've got those situations happening in almost every major city across the country.
Well, Kathleen, that there's no political currency, it seems, in actually addressing this problem. I mean, let's be frank.
Well, okay. So what if Peter Bethlenfalvy, instead of saying, I'm going to give, $200 to Galen Weston, what if he had stood up on Fall Economic Statement Day and said, okay, we're going to take $1 billion, and I don't know if that would be the number, but we're going to give $1 billion in $200 checks to people who really need it. And then we're going to take $2 billion and we're going to sit down with municipalities and we're going to look at the options. So there are shelters. Shelters are an option. Winter's coming. Something's got to happen. We're going to look at where shelters make sense. I don't know in Hamilton whether there's a need for, some of the existing shelters to have more support. We're going to look at where we can get housing, where there's housing that has started, where we can speed that up, expedite it, and get people into housing that works. We're going to work with the people who do tiny house neighborhoods. There's one in Waterloo that is, it's garden sheds. There's one ready to go in Toronto. I don't think they've got the funding yet. And those are like shelters, except people have a place to go where they can lock the door. And there are also the supports that you would get in a shelter. So there are wellness checks, and there's food provided, and there's clothing support, that kind of thing. So there's a basket of things that could be done. And I really think, you say there's no currency in terms of, or political will in terms of getting this done. But I really believe, Dave, that if the finance minister had stood up and, we're gonna put in place this Marshall Plan, here are the things that we're going to look at, here are the people who are going to lead it, and within 6 weeks we're going to have a plan. I don't know whether that's the time, but that's when it's going to start to get cold. So I think there's a lot that could have been done, and it could have been done with some of that money that's going into Galen Weston's hand.
Yeah, Tim, it becomes this whole, it's easy to sort of stand there, and I've had this conversation with the mayors. I mean, you're right. In many cases, the municipalities get in their own way on these things. So, where does that sit? I mean, it's easy to say, the province is going to step in because bike lanes are a problem for congestion. Why aren't they being more assertive on this file?
Because they don't care.
I think it's coming. Reading tea leaves, I think it is. I think it is coming. I'm smiling. It's funny how Galen Weston, the Weston family, and Loblaw have become the Darth Vaders in the province of Ontario.
He says he's a billionaire. He's a stand-in for the billionaires who are going to get $200. That's the only reason I'm using his name.
Poor Loblaw has taken a shit kicking over the last couple of years, right? Like Tim.
Just because he wears a sweater doesn't make him a nice guy.
He's a super villain.
I could use your name, Tim. Or you probably don't.
Oh man, I wish I was in that wealth class. I need the $200. You kidding me? So I think it's coming, Dave. I think this has emerged enough as an issue. Look, when I was CEO of the Ontario Real Estate Association, we did a survey in Belleville, or did some in London. And the major issue that came up was actually homelessness and public safety and fear of crime in these cities that never would have had anything like this problem in the past. So I sense there is that momentum. I think it will involve, on the law enforcement side, it may involve the notwithstanding clause because of the judge's ruling in Waterloo, which was overreach. It will have to include something on the housing side as well. And I hope pressure on the federal government, because refugees, asylum seekers have no business being in our homeless system. The federal government needs to take care of those folks, get them into good jobs, get them trained, whatever is necessary. But they shouldn't be taking up shelter spaces that are meant for those who have no home to go to and have more complex needs. I will object to what Keith's suggestion was, though, with respect to a minister in charge. And here's the problem if you have a homelessness minister. They tend to not have large budgets that they command or civil servants that they can marshal. They tend just to be a bit of a nanny to the rest of cabinet. They'll make speeches, they'll lecture, they'll put pressure, but ultimately they don't usually have the tools in the tool belt to get things done. So you need to actually have a strong minister with a large scope to take this over as the czar, or in combination with another that's health and housing. But instead, I would empower and hold accountable one of my strongest ministers to get that job I described done. And I sense it's coming.
But you know what it would do?
Can I just ask a question?
Yeah.
Tim, why? I mean, you are a sensible, smart, experienced person. Why do you let the provincial government off the hook on this? Why do you? And I heard you trying to answer Adam Vaughan the other day on the radio when, you talk about law enforcement and you talk about it's coming, but where are those people going to go? Why do you let the provincial government off the hook when they clearly have money to do things? Why do you let them off the hook in terms of things they actually could do to house people?
Well, I don't think that's that's a fair comment. And I do think that law enforcement needs to be able to clear parks. I just believe fundamentally that people don't have the right to that kind of encampment. I'm sure there are provincial funds. I'm confident they exist to help with supportive housing. And that may be compelled if they do this as a strategy to, increase those amounts, make them more accessible. I do think the fundamental issue is nobody wants another neighborhood. It's more so NIMBYism and a cowardice at the local level to decide where these types of shelters are going. This is not simply a Canadian problem, certainly not simply an Ontario problem. It's a North American problem. Other American cities have handled this by having temporary housing that exists. You mentioned small homes on municipal parking lots, areas that are outside of, busy neighborhoods. So I do sense that this is actually going to be a winner for the provincial government because it is rising up as a concern in mid and large size cities. I believe it will be comprehensive, and to get it actually done, you need to have a strong minister with a significant amount of tools at their disposal to be the lead and put pressure to get it done.
But you know what, Tim, that if the premier actually created another cabinet position, he'd have the opportunity to, make life more affordable for another one of his MPPs, just because
Oh dear.
I couldn't resist.
We'll also get $200.
That's right. You know what I found was interesting, and Keith, you flagged this, was the whole the revenue issue with the LCBO, and that we were talking about, will we find out what the real cost of the alcohol licensing was? But it seems though the revenues were down, and the government is blaming the strike in the summer.
Oh yeah, those evil unions. Although the finance minister, he's very smooth, by the way, was very careful not to blame the union. We struck a deal, the costs are on everyone's side, but basically the government's saying, yeah, that's cost at least $100 million in revenue. And then they point that in 27, 28 or 26, 27, that the LCBO's projected revenues are going to be actually $800 million higher than they were projected in the March budget, skipping over the fact that for the next 2 years, they're going to be about $500 million plus, $500 million plus below forecast because of the government's changes to the system. We also learned that, remember the government had said we knew they were paying $250 million to break the beer store contract a year early to put the beer and wine and mixed drinks in the corner stores. Well, we found out in the fall economic statement, there's another $179 million, almost $200 million going to refund LCBO fees to the brewers and other associations. Then we found that you add in these lost revenues. All of a sudden, with these lost, we are up to $1 billion to put booze into corner stores and in service stations. So that's a hell of a priority for a government to be laying out that kind of money for. But at least we're now getting what the actual costs are. The LCBO for the next 2 years, some serious losses, and they won't be attributed to the strike. They'll be attributed solely to the government's changes and modernization, if you will, of the liquor retailing plan in Ontario.
Well, John, the LCBO may get all that business back based on some of the noise you're hearing from retailers who are saying, listen, this is great, except, we didn't plan on the recycling, the right. Bottle return part of all of this. I remember when I was a kid, you used to bring your Coke bottles back, and they were equipped to do that. They are not now, and now they're responsible for it. If you sell the beer, you sell the wine, you got to take the bottles back. And there are some who are saying it's just not worth it for us. They're talking about giving that license back.
Yeah, and then with full disclosure, and it is in the public domain, I did all of the research for the Convenience Store Association of Canada on this issue in every province across the country. As I said, it's in the public domain. But I think what you've touched on here is something that's really, really important, and that is there's a poison pill in all of this. If the beer store has given up some market share because it's going to go to convenience stores, which even in my own neighborhood have invested a fair bit with an enclosed service in a packing area that's outside of the main core of the store. What you hear is of beer being just delivered and dropped when nobody is there. I mean, there's deliveries that are taking place when people are not around to actually take it into the store. It's being left on sidewalks. I mean, I could be taken to task for this, but that's what I hear from some of the convenience store owners. Secondly, the poison pill is, in fact, the requirements that will come where they've got to clean out all the bottles. They've got to stack it in a particular way. They have to make sure there's no cigarette butts or anything. It's, and what's being imposed on them, in fact, is the same standards that would have been at a big place like the beer store, where you take back and they take care of all of that stuff. So there's a hidden cost, a hidden tax in all of this to the convenience store owners. And you're right, there are a good number of them now who are saying, I'm not going to go down this path. It's just not worth it to me because of all of the cost and expense that's going to be put into it. So in a way, the government may end up having another issue on its plate that it could have anticipated, and that is that there are a whole bunch of convenience stores who are going to close up that area of their shop and say, no more, I'm going to give it back. And then you're back to where you were before.
But Tim, wasn't the simple answer to say, we're going to do all of this, and the function, among other things, of the beer store, not only to distribute some of it to various locations, is to take the empties back? And wouldn't that have been the simple solution?
Sorry, the LCBO take the empties back?
No, the beer store. They're already doing it. Why wouldn't we just let them keep on doing it?
Yeah, I'm shaking my head with this, and this strikes me as something that I don't think the minister or the premier were aware of when it comes to the rules are going to force onto some of these small mom and pop operators. I mean, look, I don't see it as much as I used to, but holy crow, the worst job you had after cleaning up after you had a house party was fishing the cigarettes out of, half-drunk beer bottles. It was gross. I can't imagine that they're going to have to do that for whatever comes in, from customers. Can I tell a quick story?
Yeah.
So, Andy Brandt, God rest his soul, just recently passed away, should be in the Political Hall of Fame. He had the most plum appointment as chair of the LCBO under Conservative, Liberal, and New Democrat governments. How he achieved that was incredible. And when he announced his retirement, Premier Harris was a guest speaker, congratulated Andy on all the increased sales, and then Harris paused in the line and said, but you ran a goddamn liquor monopoly. It couldn't have been that hard, right? And I just can't believe how often it seems to me the LCBO is screwing up. This policy does not seem well thought through. They had the whole bags debacle. They're going to put money into vestibules that we had all stand in before we go into the store. It was usually seen as pretty, not an easy run, but money would just come in the door, and it just seems like they've had screw up after screw up. Maybe it's ministerial. I just think they've got a confidence problem.
Yeah, well, and I think it's one of those things, Kathleen, when you start to talk about the LCBO, no matter what some of these snags are administratively, or how we're executing certain ideas or policies, I think the experience in the store, most people look at it and say, I'm good with it, and they're okay with the fact that the money that's going to the LCBO is supporting government services.
For sure. And I mean, people like the LCBO. I think, to Tim's point about screw up after screw up, this is all happening months earlier than it was supposed to, right? There was a plan to move this, as I understand it, the government was going to do this when the agreement with the beer store was expired and so on, and they rushed it again because it's a pre-election move. This stuff is complicated. It was our government that put wine and beer into grocery stores around the province. That was a hard negotiated. It was a difficult agreement to negotiate. We worked on getting the licenses in particular grocery stores, and I mean, there was a whole raft of things that we had to deal with. And again, with working with the beer store and as the recycler. I think what's happened here is the time was not taken. As Tim said, this seems like it's not well thought through. I think that's exactly right. I think it's exactly the case that the government rushed on this. The premier, there may be things the premier wasn't aware of that he should have been aware of, and he would have been aware of if they had gone through due process and had thought it through. And I don't understand at all why the beer store can't just continue to be the recycler. They've got the expertise. It makes sense. And I just think this is, if there isn't a reversal on this, then the implementation of the policy of putting beer and wine in these outlets it's not going to happen in the way the government thinks it was going to.
Yeah, and I don't know that I'd be wanting to actually put up the post at the convenience store. We need butt pickers to join the staff.
Gross.
Gross doesn't matter how you cut it, right? Before we go, we will meet again after the day of the reckoning in the United States, and we'd be remiss if I didn't get your take on where we sit right now. Keith, as a reporter, I know you've covered both sides of the border. Both of us have. I would be so bloody frustrated as a journalist assigned to any of these campaigns, whether it was a down ballot campaign or the top of the ballot campaign. I can see it. You can hear it in voices where there is why the hell am I bothering, almost, because the storytelling just seems to be so challenging around good journalism in this particular campaign in the United States.
Well, you can't even phrase a question without, you've shown your bias and you're not, you're a Trump dementia, or, it's ridiculous. I mean, it's so difficult to actually get to the actual facts. You've got people that are making shit up all the time, and in front of tens of thousands of people. As you say, as a reporter, I don't know how to sort it out. I'm glad I'm not assigned to cover any of those campaigns. I mean, you look right now, Harris is being held responsible for something Biden said, but Trump is even held responsible for things Trump says. I mean, it's just so far off the beam. So as a voter right now in the United States, looking ahead to next Tuesday, I truly don't know how it comes down. I really think that they're correct. I mean, even though the polls show it's basically, a dead heat within the margin of error or whatever, that Trump performs better than he polls. I think he polls underneath. So I think he's got a real chance of doing this next week, of defeating Harris. Or the other alternative, and this is what I think most of us hope for, that an awful lot of Republicans say, we've just had enough of this crap, and they stay home. And I think that's the best outcome for most of us can see. But if Trump voters go out in numbers, if the Republicans all stay behind him at the ballot box, I think he wins.
Well, John, I was geeking out on the flight to and from Halifax on the weekend, and I was listening to the Economist's podcast.
Right.
And it was two parts on probability models, and I thought, oh my God, this is where we've gone. And I know you and I have talked about this in the past, but they dipped into the history of it, and it's just, for all intents and purposes, it's sport betting that's applied to politics. And when you look at it, you can say the New York Yankees were going to be in the World Series, and it was more likely that the LA Dodgers were going to win the World Series based on all of these factors and, the history of the players and so on. And we try to do that in politics, and it's taking over so much of the oxygen around this. So when people see those probability models, they're equating them with polls. And I wonder where your pollster brain blows up.
Well, I think after doing this for, God knows, almost 35 years, I kind of check out on all of that stuff and go to ground. The issue with the American election is, number one, most of the polling that's done at the national level is irrelevant because it comes down to 10 states. And within the 10 states, there's about 5 that matter. And within the 5 that matter, the swing is probably about 1% to 2%. I mean, we're talking about Pennsylvania, that if the Puerto Rican group of 475,000 in that state decide to move to a majority over to the Democrats, well, then it's going to swing a state. I mean, honestly, it gets down to a very small amount. We don't know, whether Trump supporters are underrepresented in the polls, and therefore you get the surge at the last minute, versus women and Swifties on the other side who are also saying one thing to pollsters and their husbands and may vote in another way. It's a complete mugs game. What I will say is this: we're going to be into a dilemma for, a good couple of months, because, as you know, we're going to end up with the vote that takes place between the time that the polls close to midnight, when most of us would be sitting there and say, honey, it's time to go to bed, we'll catch the results in the morning, and a declaration probably by the Republicans that they have won, because we're not over into California. Number two, by the time we wake up in the morning, that may have shifted a little bit, but then we're going to have the 120 lawsuits that are already being proffered in the legislative system in the United States. activated so that, there's a big challenge to, who won and who didn't win. So the next phase will be challenging the voters' records, challenging the voters' machines, everything that we saw the last time. The next phase will be the reckoning in the courts who decide whether it goes to the Supreme Court or not. And then the last reckoning will be in the final 2 weeks as we lead up to January 6th yet again, or 5th or whatever day it is, to the ascension of power and who's going to actually take it. I don't, I listen to a number of pollsters that I really respect in the United States, Cliff Young from Ipsos probably being the most. And even there isn't anything for sure except the potential backlash to Canada, where there's a support among both political supporters for up to 20% tariffs on everything that we have going across the border. So I don't think anything's going to be solved on election night. I don't think any probability model is something I would even listen to, because there's some hidden, Easter eggs in all of this. But I got to tell you, I think we're in for a wild ride for about 2 months, and I would sure buckle up.
Yeah, Tim, I heard the phrase lawfare is what we're facing right now, and the number of it's not even the number of briefs that are being prepared to challenge certain things. There's already responses to the briefs, so we're so far down the road here on the integrity of the election already being called into question. I don't know how you get that back.
I guess you'll see what the margin ends up being, right? That's all very fair, and maybe we'll be 2 or 3 podcasts, and this will still be our last topic on each of those with an undecided. But look, if you asked, what would we wager if we needed to? Look, I think the issue matrix actually favors Republicans in the states around affordability, a bad immigration system, and crime, and they all move well on the Republican side. When I watch the closing arguments of the campaigns, it seems like Trump's is more consistent, and the Harris campaign about calling Trump the fascist or unstable, I think people have already made up their minds. I'm not sure how many votes that actually moves. And I think the central weakness of the Kamala Harris campaign is that there's 2 basic questions she didn't adequately address. How is she different from Joe Biden? And secondly, how does she reconcile her previous positions, which are on the left side of the spectrum, with a more mainstream approach? Our panelist Kathleen Wynne did an excellent job at not being Dalton McGuinty. As the opposition leader that was ahead in the polls, I saw that dwindling away as people said, okay, she's very different in the way she approaches issues and what she wants to do. Harris has failed to do so. So my prediction is a narrow landslide. I think it's a narrow polling result on total vote, but I think the electoral votes fall to Trump and he wins by a significant number.
The difference for you, Kathleen, is you weren't running for premier while Dalton McGuinty was still sitting in the premier's chair. Right. So that's slightly different. But to Tim's point, that is an important part of it. But if the votes are already baked in, again, I'm just kind of looking at this from afar. But the analysis suggests that if Harris has any advantage, it's her machinery to get the vote out. And if it's that close, the margins are that close, that door knocking, that get the vote out, get people to ride to the polling stations is really going to be critical. I mean, in the absence of Elon Musk's $1 million
van.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing just makes my blood run cold. I just have a hard time imagining how the people of the United States would elect Donald Trump. And, to the point about the closing arguments, if you're Puerto Rican and you live in Pennsylvania and you listen to that comic at the rally, who was chosen by Trump's people, make that incredibly racist, horrible comment, I just don't know how you not vote for Kamala Harris. But I'll tell you guys, my son and my sister and I are going to be in Philadelphia this weekend. And so I'll report back to you next week. The election will be over, but I'll do a debrief on what it felt like. See what's happening. Yeah.
Well, and I think that really that sort of that ground game that, we talked a little earlier about Musk paying people to go out. And I would think it's a completely, Tim, a different dynamic rather than having passionate, committed volunteer. Here's $200 and go and knock on this many doors. I think, the result slightly different, particularly at the messaging at the door.
Yeah. And look, you guys made excellent points. The Democrats had a very strong ground game. I suspect they'll bring a strong ground game, but Political parties are very flexible. They're very adaptable. A tactic that one uses pops up in the campaign next time around for their opponents. So I got to think the Republicans spent the last 4 years building up their own muscle on the ground game.
Yeah, well, it'll be all good fun. So let's you guys make the popcorn, and we'll share it all next time we sit. So Kathleen Wynne, Tim Hudak, John Wright, and Keith Leslie, they are the front bench here on the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. And by the way, I mentioned this last week, that if you are interested in making a comment, we've got the talkback feature now. So it will be in the show notes for this program and all the programs that we're running. So it's right there. The address is speakpipe.com and /on the ledge. So all you have to do is go to that site, you get to the button, hit start recording, you got 90 seconds, and leave us a flowery message why you think Tim Hudak's costume as a fiscal conservative was just knocking it out of the park this week. So let's do it that way, shall we? That is On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. I'm Dave Trafford for Story Studio Network.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.